"Let me shoulder this with you," Cowboy said to the half-naked woman passed out from hard work. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and the splintered wood of the fence posts Abigail was trying to set. Every strike of the mallet against the post sent a jarring shock up her arms, vibrating through bones that ached with a fatigue so deep it felt like a part of her soul. Her chemise was plastered to her back, a useless, damp rag against the relentless heat, her corset and dress having been abandoned hours ago in a desperate bid for relief. Dust caked her skin, mingling with sweat to form a gritty paste in the creases of her elbows and the hollow of her throat. She had inherited this land, this sprawling, unforgiving patch of Wyoming, when her husband, John, had been taken by a fever 6 months prior. He had left her with a mountain of debt, a herd of cattle threatening to wander through the broken fences, and the crushing weight of his unfulfilled dreams. She refused to let them die. She would not be the widow who sold out and ran back east with her tail between her legs. This land was hers now, and she would bleed for it if she had to. The horizon shimmered, a watery illusion that made the distant mountains dance. A wave of dizziness washed over her, blurring the sharp edges of the world into a soft, humming haze. Her head pounded in rhythm with the mallet's impacts. Just one more post, she told herself, her mantra for the past week. Just one more. She raised the heavy mallet one last time, her muscles screaming in protest. The world tilted violently, the brilliant blue sky and the pale, dusty ground swapping places before dissolving into a roaring blackness. The mallet slipped from her numb fingers, thudding softly into the dirt beside her as she crumpled to the ground, a forgotten soldier on a battlefield of her own making. The last sensation she had was the searing heat of the ground against her cheek, a final, brutal kiss from the land she was fighting so hard to tame. She didn't hear the slow, steady hoofbeats approaching, or see the tall figure that dismounted, his shadow falling over her still form like a promise of rain. She was lost in the silent, suffocating darkness of exhaustion, completely unaware that her solitary war had just been witnessed. When consciousness returned, it was not with a jolt, but as a slow, creeping dawn. The first thing Abigail registered was coolness. Not the biting chill of a mountain night, but the gentle, life-giving cool of shade and water. A damp cloth rested on her forehead, and the brutal sun was no longer beating down on her. She blinked, her vision swimming back into focus. A man knelt beside her, his back partially to her as he wrung out the cloth in a canteen. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in dusty, well-worn clothes that spoke of a long time on the trail. His movements were deliberate, economical, with no wasted motion. She tried to sit up, a gasp escaping her lips as every muscle protested. The man turned at the sound. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, with a stillness about his eyes that was both unnerving and calming. He wasn't handsome in the way of the men from back east, with their soft hands and easy smiles. His was a face that belonged to the hard country around them, etched with the story of survival. Panic, sharp and cold, shot through her. A lone woman, half-dressed, and a strange man. Her hand instinctively went to her hip, searching for the small pistol she usually carried, only to remember it was back at the cabin. She pulled the torn fabric of her chemise closer around her shoulders, a futile gesture of modesty. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. He didn't answer immediately, instead holding the canteen to her lips. "Drink," he commanded, his voice a low baritone, as rough and steady as the land itself. She hesitated, her mind screaming with warnings her mother had drilled into her. Never trust a stranger. Never show weakness. But the thirst was a raging fire in her throat. She drank, the water the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "You collapsed," he stated simply, as if discussing the weather. The sun can be a cruel master. He looked past her, at the line of unsteady fence posts, at the heavy mallet lying in the dust. His gaze took in the whole desperate picture. "You need help." Abigail bristled, the water giving her enough strength to feel indignant. "I don't need anything from you." It was a lie, a foolish, prideful lie, and they both knew it. She was failing. The proof was all around them. He simply nodded, accepting her words without argument, which somehow felt worse than a dismissal. He stood up, a tall, solid presence against the vast, empty landscape. "My name is Marcus," he said, not as an introduction, but as a simple fact. "I'll take a look at that fence." He turned and walked toward the line of her shoddy work, leaving her in the shade of the cottonwood tree, her suspicion warring with a terrifying, overwhelming sense of relief. Pride was a luxury Abigail could no longer afford. For 2 days, she watched from the porch as Marcus worked. He moved with a quiet competence that was both infuriating and awe-inspiring. He didn't just mend the fence, he rebuilt it. He pulled up her wobbly posts, dug deeper holes, and set them with a strength and precision she could never match. He worked from sunup to sundown, pausing only to drink from his canteen and wipe the sweat from his brow. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. On the 3rd morning, she couldn't stand it anymore. The shame of her weakness was less potent than the practical, undeniable truth: without him, she would lose everything. She met him by the half-finished fence line, a tin plate of biscuits and bacon in her hands. "I can't pay you much," she began, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. "Not until I sell some of the herd in the fall. But you can have a room in the barn, and your meals." She hated the tremor in her voice, the plea she couldn't quite disguise. He stopped his work, taking the plate from her. His calloused fingers brushed against hers, and a strange warmth, entirely different from the sun's oppressive heat, spread up her arm. He looked at the food, then at her. "Fair wages," he said, and that was that. The agreement was sealed, not with a handshake, but with a shared plate of biscuits under the wide Wyoming sky. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. They were a silent team, their partnership forged in the shared language of labor. She would rise before dawn to milk the cow and prepare their meals, while he was already out, the rhythmic thud of his mallet a steady heartbeat for the struggling ranch. She'd bring him water in the heat of the day, and he would wordlessly accept it, his eyes conveying a gratitude he never spoke. Her internal monologue, once a constant stream of fear and panic, began to change. She found herself watching him, cataloguing the small details. The way he could soothe her most skittish mare with a low murmur and a steady hand. The methodical way he sharpened his tools at the end of each day. The lines around his eyes that crinkled just slightly when her old dog, Buster, would drop a stick at his feet. She was still wary, still guarded, but a new feeling was taking root in the barren soil of her heart, a grudging, profound respect. He wasn't just a drifter, he was a builder. And as he rebuilt her fences, she felt the broken barriers around herself beginning, ever so slightly, to mend. The blistering heat of summer slowly yielded to the golden light and crisp mornings of autumn. The last of the southern fence line was completed, a strong, unbreachable barrier that stood as a testament to their combined efforts. The cattle were secure, and for the first time in months, a sliver of peace settled in Abigail's chest. But a ranch was a relentless beast, always demanding more. The barn roof, which had been a minor worry, became a critical problem as the season turned. A leaking roof meant ruined hay, and ruined hay meant starving livestock come winter. They started work on it together, a new, more intricate dance of cooperation. He was on the roof, pulling away the rotten shingles, while she was below, hauling up new ones on a rope pulley system they had rigged. Their communication remained sparse, but it was efficient. More nails, he'd call down, and she would have them ready. Careful now, she'd warn as a gust of wind threatened his balance, and he would give a short nod of acknowledgement. The silence between them was no longer a void of suspicion, but a comfortable space filled with the sounds of their shared work. The evenings grew longer and cooler, and their shared meals moved from the porch to the small kitchen table. The first few times, they ate in a tense quiet, the clinking of their forks against the tin plates unnaturally loud. But gradually, the quiet softened. One night, he complimented her stew. It was a simple phrase, "This is good," but it felt like a monumental declaration. She found herself telling him about her father, who had taught her to cook. He, in turn, told her a brief story about working a cattle drive down in Texas. They were small offerings, tiny pieces of their pasts laid bare on the table between them. She noticed he had started leaving a small pile of freshly chopped kindling by the back door every morning, saving her one of her most hated chores. She, in turn, took to mending the small tears in his work shirts, leaving them folded neatly on the crate he used as a bedside table in the barn. These were not spoken kindnesses, they were quiet, practical acts of care. They were the gestures of two people who were learning to depend on each other, who were discovering that the weight of a struggling ranch was easier to bear when the load was shared. The respect she felt for him was now mingled with a burgeoning, unfamiliar warmth, a fragile hope taking root as the leaves on the cottonwood trees turned to gold. The change came without warning, a brutal shift from the crisp beauty of late autumn to the raw fury of winter. The sky, a placid blue one moment, turned a bruised, menacing grey the next. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the window panes and clawed at the new shingles on the barn roof. Marcus was out checking on a newborn calf and its mother when the first flakes began to fall, not the gentle, drifting snow of a peaceful winter's day, but a hard, stinging sleet driven by a gale-force wind. Abigail watched from the cabin window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The world outside was disappearing, swallowed by a churning vortex of white. Visibility dropped to mere feet. He had been gone too long. Tying a rope around her waist and securing the other end to the porch railing, she ventured into the maelstrom, calling his name until her throat was raw. Just as a terrifying despair began to set in, a large shape materialized out of the blizzard. It was Marcus, half carrying, half dragging the weak calf, its mother stumbling behind him. He was covered in snow, his face grim and set against the punishing wind. Together, they wrestled the animals into the relative warmth of the barn and fought their way back to the cabin, slamming the door shut against the raging storm. For 3 days, the blizzard howled. They were prisoners in the tiny, 2-room cabin, the world reduced to the 4 walls around them and the endless, roaring white outside. The forced proximity was absolute. There was no work to be done, no fences to mend, no escape from each other's presence. The first day was tense, the small space crackling with an unspoken energy. But as the storm raged on, their defenses began to crumble. They huddled by the fire, the only source of light and warmth. To fill the oppressive silence, they began to talk. Truly talk. He told her about his family, a wife and son lost to cholera on the Oregon Trail years ago, a tragedy that had untethered him and set him adrift. He spoke of it with a flat, emotionless tone that was more heartbreaking than any tears. Abigail, in turn, spoke of John, of their shared dreams for this land, but also of her secret fear that she was not strong enough to see it through alone. In the flickering firelight, isolated from the rest-off world, they were no longer just a widow and a drifter. They were Abigail and Marcus, 2 lonely souls sharing their scars, their vulnerabilities laid bare by the honesty that only a raging storm and a shared, precarious survival could evoke. The world was born anew in silence and blinding white. When Abigail awoke on the 4th morning, the roaring wind had ceased, replaced by a profound, muffled stillness. The blizzard had passed. She looked out the window to a landscape transformed, every harsh line and jagged edge softened and smoothed by a thick, pristine blanket of snow. It was beautiful and daunting. Marcus was already awake, stoking the embers in the fireplace. He turned as she approached, and the look that passed between them was different. The storm had broken something open, scouring away the last remnants of formality and caution. The secrets they had shared in the firelight now hung in the quiet air between them, a new, invisible thread connecting them. "We should check the livestock," he said, his voice softer than she was used to. They bundled up and stepped outside, the cold air a sharp, clean shock after days spent indoors. The snow was waist-deep in places, and he walked ahead, forging a path for her to follow. In the barn, they found a scene of quiet survival. The animals were safe, huddled together for warmth. But in a far corner, the calf they had saved was shivering violently, its mother nudging it with a worried nose. Without a word, Marcus scooped the small animal into his arms. Its legs were like ice. "It won't make it out here," he said, his voice tight with concern. He carried the calf back to the cabin, Abigail hurrying behind him. He laid it on a pile of old blankets she'd spread before the hearth, and began to rub its frail body with a rough burlap sack, trying to stimulate circulation. Abigail watched him, her heart aching with a strange, powerful emotion. She saw in that moment the man he truly was, not just the stoic, competent worker, but a protector, a man with a deep well of gentleness he kept hidden beneath a rough exterior. He murmured soft, encouraging words to the animal, his large, calloused hand surprisingly tender. She knelt beside him, adding her own warmth and touch to the effort. As they worked together, side by side, to save this one fragile life, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that the last of her walls had crumbled into dust. The practical arrangement was long gone, replaced by a bond forged in hardship, sealed in crisis, and now, finally, acknowledged in the quiet intimacy of a shared, gentle act. Hope was no longer a fragile seedling, it was beginning to bloom, warm and bright. In the middle of the frozen landscape, winter tightened its grip, a long, relentless season of bitter cold and hard work. The days were a constant battle against the elements, a cycle of chopping wood, hauling water, and ensuring the livestock were fed and safe from the biting wind. Yet, the hardship felt different now. It was no longer a solitary struggle but a shared endeavor. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, an easy synchronicity that made the heaviest tasks feel lighter. The cabin, once a lonely shelter, now felt like a warm, vibrant home against the starkness of the frozen world. The space between them, once measured in feet and cautious silence, had shrunk to inches and was filled with a palpable, humming energy. It was in the small moments that the change was most profound. An accidental brush of his arm against hers as they passed in the narrow hallway sent a thrilling shock through her entire body. The way his eyes would find hers across the dinner table, holding her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. He started to smile more, not a wide, easy grin, but a small, quiet lifting at the corners of his mouth that was reserved just for her. One evening, after a day spent digging out a snow-drifted path to the well, a task that had left them both exhausted and chilled to the bone, she found him on the small porch. He was leaning against a post, staring up at the brilliant, cold stars that glittered in the ink-black sky. He didn't seem to notice the cold. She came out with a thick wool blanket, wrapping it around his broad shoulders. He turned, surprised, his breath misting in the frigid air. "You'll freeze," she said softly. He looked down at her, his expression serious in the pale moonlight. "I wasn't planning on staying through the winter," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "I never stay in one place for longer." Abigail's heart clenched. She had known, of course, that he was a wanderer, but she had allowed herself to forget. "The spring thaw will open the roads," she said, her own voice barely a whisper, stating the practical truth that felt like a knife twisting in her gut. "Yes," he said, his gaze intense. "It will." He reached out, his gloved fingers gently touching her cheek. "But I find I'm no longer in a hurry to see what's on the other side of those mountains. I'm no longer looking for the road." In that moment, under the vast, silent watch of the stars, the slow burn of respect and affection finally ignited into a clear, undeniable flame. The first sign of the thaw was the sound of dripping water, a steady, rhythmic tapping of melting icicles on the cabin roof. It was the sound of the world waking from its long slumber. The harsh white landscape began to recede, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. Patches of green appeared on the southern-facing hills, and the creek, frozen solid for months, began to flow again with a joyful, gurgling rush. The entire world seemed to be breathing a collective sigh of relief, and Abigail felt it in her own soul. The ranch, which had been a place of struggle and survival, was now thrumming with the promise of new life. Her favorite mare, Daisy, gave birth to a long-legged, wobbly foal one bright April morning. It was a perfect, healthy colt, and its arrival felt like a powerful symbol, a sign from the land itself that their hard work was bearing fruit. Abigail and Marcus stood together, leaning on the fence of the corral, watching the foal take its first uncertain steps. It stumbled, then found its footing, nudging against its mother's side. A feeling of profound contentment washed over Abigail. This was what she had fought for, bled for. This new life, this continuation. The ranch was no longer failing, it was being reborn, just as she was. Their relationship had settled into a deep, quiet love, as natural and certain as the turning of the seasons. There were no grand declarations, no flowery speeches. Their love was expressed in the way he would take the heavier bucket from her hands without being asked, in the way she would save him the last piece of pie, in the comfortable silence they could share while watching the sun go down. One evening, as the sky was painted in fiery shades of orange and pink, they stood on the porch, a familiar ritual that now marked the end of their days. He reached over and took her hand. It wasn't a practical gesture to help her over a rough patch of ground or an accidental brush of fingers. He simply took her hand and laced his fingers through hers, holding it firmly, possessively. It was a statement. A promise. He looked from their joined hands to her face. "Abigail," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "This place, this life, it feels like home." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of joy and relief. "It wasn't," she confessed softly, squeezing his hand. "It was just a piece of land I was afraid to lose." "It's only home because you're here." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting them in the soft glow of twilight, two solitary figures who had found their whole world in each other. Their commitment to one another was not forged in a church or marked by a ring, but in the daily act of building a life from the ground up. The promise they made was not one of words, but of action. It was in the seeds they planted together in the newly tilled garden, their hands digging into the same rich soil. It was in the plans they drew in the dirt with a stick, mapping out a new pasture or an extension to the barn. It was in the shared belief that their future was not a terrifying, uncertain thing to be faced alone, but a hopeful landscape to be explored together. The ranch thrived under their joint care. The profits from the cattle sale in the fall were enough to clear the last of John's debts and purchase a new bull to improve the herd. Marcus, with his quiet foresight, had a knack for husbandry and a deep understanding of the land that felt innate. He saw where to rotate the grazing fields to let the grass recover, how to reinforce the creek bank to prevent erosion, and which cattle to cull and which to keep. Abigail, in turn, managed their finances with a sharp mind, her careful planning ensuring that every dollar was stretched, every resource maximized. She was the steady hand on the tiller, while he was the strong wind in the sails. They were a formidable team, their individual strengths complementing each other perfectly. They were no longer the desperate widow and the stoic drifter. They had been remade by the land and by each other. She, who had fiercely guarded her independence, learned that accepting help was not a weakness but a different kind of strength, the strength to build something larger than herself. He, who had wandered for years with a hollowed-out heart, learned that a home was not a place to run from, but a person to run to. Standing on the porch of the home they had saved, watching the verdant field stretch out before them, they were living proof that love wasn't always a sudden, passionate storm. Sometimes, it was a quiet, steady thing, built post by post, season by season, a shelter strong enough to weather anything the world could throw at it. It was a foundation of mutual respect, a structure of shared burdens, and a roof of quiet, unwavering devotion. 5 years passed, as quickly and as surely as the seasons. The ranch was no longer a place of struggle, but one of abundance. The small cabin had been expanded, a new wing added to accommodate a growing family. The barn was freshly painted a deep, welcoming red, and the fences Marcus had built stood straight and true, a dark, defining line against the rolling green hills. The land was tamed, but not broken, a testament to a partnership that worked in harmony with it, not against it. On a warm summer evening, Abigail stood on the porch, a place that had become the heart of their world. She was no longer the gaunt, desperate woman on the verge of collapse. Her face was fuller, etched with laugh lines around her eyes, her hands still calloused but no longer trembling with exhaustion. Marcus came to stand beside her, his arm wrapping around her waist in a familiar, comforting gesture. He looked much the same, his face still weathered, but the haunted stillness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, settled peace. The sound of children's laughter drifted up from the creek bank, where a boy with his father's dark hair and a girl with her mother's determined spirit were trying to catch frogs. The sound was the sweetest music the ranch had ever known. They watched their children play, a living, breathing manifestation of their love, a future they had never dared to dream of on their own. Their journey had not been an easy one. It began in the dust and desperation of a sun-scorched field, a moment of collapse that led to an unlikely partnership. It was a story built not on grand romance, but on the quiet nobility of shared labor, the slow mending of fences both physical and emotional. They had discovered that the strongest foundations are not built on passionate declarations, but on the bedrock of mutual respect and the unwavering promise to face every hardship, every storm, and every sunrise, together. They learned that a home is not just a structure of wood and nails, but a sanctuary you build within the heart of another, a safe harbor found in the simple, profound act of one person turning to another and saying, without words, let me shoulder this with you.